Hi everybody, welcome back to PCS 101, and this is for our class for September 17th, where we are discussing some of the textbook chapters to prepare us for ultimately delivering speeches. So you can see in the notes below that our first speech is going to be due on the 16th of October. This is a 5-minute autobiographical speech that gives the audience some information about you and your life, whether you decide to do a brief life overview or you decide to focus on a particular element such as a hobby or an educational goal. And you'll be uploading that into Moodle. I'll be adding a folder onto our Moodle site, and I'll talk a little bit more about how to upload that into Moodle. It's pretty intuitive, and I ask that you send your speaking outline to me via email. Well, that's just how my grading program works best. And we'll talk more about speaking outlines, but basically, you want to have an outline in front of you, much like I have an outline in front of me. And basically, what I have in front of me is the outline that you have electronically. That gives me an idea of what it is that I want to talk about, keywords and phrases. Note that it's not overly detailed, and the point is just to jog your memory about the important pieces you want to talk about, because you want to try to be as conversational as possible. So last class, after viewing a Toastmasters video, I began talking about some of the chapters in the textbook, and that our class is basically a kind of lab. So you can practice and you can offer feedback to your peers. And the idea that speeches are integrative, in other words, we see shared values when we hear the speeches of others. They're redundant. Repetition will be so important, as we will talk about. People have very poor listening and memory skills. So you'll be redundant in a way that you probably normally wouldn't be in your writing. They are concrete, or should be, as specific as possible, and they are situational, so you vary things based on the time or based on the place. And the speaker, which is what you're probably focused on, you're the source of the message. The message is the information, and oftentimes includes your emotional feelings about the message, your attitudes. But the audience is just as important, and you will be doing both, serving as both speaker and audience member, because you will be listening to the speeches of your peers. So things that interfere with listening to speeches, barriers to receiving communication. They could be physical, they could be emotional, they could be intellectual, or all of the above. And more on this in a few moments. And that speeches are transactional, and they're interactive, and they're circular. It's not just linear where you've got a message going to an audience. It's not just relational where the audience is giving feedback. You have a speaker who gives a message to the audience, and the audience will probably give some sort of response so that the speaker can adjust accordingly. Again, depending on the situation, if you are taping yourself as you are now, or recording yourself, I should say, as you are now, for this particular class, that is one of the challenges, is that you don't have a live audience in front of you. Though there's nothing to preclude you from having a live audience in front of you as you are recording, if you find that to be easier for you. Now, the idea is that all of this requires a certain level of ethical awareness, that you are going to be as ethical as possible, and you are also going to use logic and emotion to motivate your audience. Aristotle, the great philosopher, talked about this and identified logos as logic, ethos as ethics, and pathos as emotions. And all of these are important elements, but I've become increasingly interested in ethos and the ethics, particularly as a consumer, an audience member of speeches, though there are other reasons why we focus on public speaking. There is a social imperative. Just because of human interaction, it's important to be able to communicate with others, and an intellectual imperative, just as a well-educated individual, that you've got a background in rhetoric and speaking. But again, I see how civil discourse is becoming increasingly challenging, in our society. So I encourage you to not only engage in civil discourse, but to demand civil discourse when you are an audience member. Because there will be lots of worldviews, lots of multiple perspectives and beliefs. Your audience will be diverse, and diversity just means difference. And you'll have lots of cultural groups within your audience. And the cultural group, in the broadest sense of the word, is just a kind of group membership. And through group membership, there is a predictive element about what members of that group, or many members of that group, might believe, what they think is true and false, what their attitudes might be about something, their emotions about something. And the values are usually highly ingrained and include beliefs and attitudes. Behaviors, too, are oftentimes predictable, but of course, you don't want to overgeneralize. You don't want to stereotype and assume that everyone is the same. And understand that we all have biases. So we want to try to be aware of our own biases and call out other people on their biases. And guess what? AI has biases too, because AI has been programmed through the work of human beings. So we try to be as what we call culturally intelligent as possible. We try to be sensitive and we try to be competent to all of the differences that will exist in our audiences, to adapt to different cultural perspectives, and to show empathy and emotional support, to try to take somebody else's perspective. And I teach English classes, as you know, and I can tell you that literary studies are a wonderful opportunity to practice empathy. The idea of seeing someone else's viewpoint in, let's say, a short story or a drama, and then talking, or a novel, and understanding their view of the world and other people's view of the world, people that you might never even interact with on a day-to-day basis, but you're doing so through the world of fiction. And then the elephant in the room, anxiety. Everybody's going to feel anxiety. There is anxiety that is just generalized. Some people tend to just be anxious. That's known as trait apprehension. And then there is anxiety that's usually focused on a situation. State apprehension. And I know that public speaking oftentimes is associated with state apprehension. And there even is a term for the fear of public speaking, glossophobia. So our last attendance question was asking you to consider ways to reduce anxiety. Not that there's any kind of magic bullet, but I certainly suggest that being well prepared, that making sure that you have a speaking outline, that making sure that you have practiced, that you are comfortable in what you are wearing. All of those things can be helpful in terms of reducing anxiety. Meditation, good sleep, good food, all of those are also wonderful techniques that I'm sure that some of you might have utilized in other situations that have evoked anxiety. So just think about that anxiety isn't necessarily a bad thing. It just shows that you've got a heightened awareness, but you don't want it to stand in the way of you being able to perform. And that all of us are in that proverbial same boat, that we all feel a certain level of anxiety when we speak to our peers in a public situation. So the chapters that I had assigned for today, chapter 4, understanding the difference between hearing, processing sound, which is pretty passive, as opposed to listening, paying attention, understanding, and being active. And certainly we want to listen as carefully as possible to the speeches of our peers. One of the great ways to do that is by taking notes. It's one of the ways that we suggest that students do that in college. If you're taking notes, you want to do more than just write something down. You want to review them afterwards. You want to relate them, connect them to things that you already know, and you want to think about how it might be related to future elements that you might be learning. And there are lots of barriers to paying attention. If there are terms associated with this, like daydreaming, There are other terms that are a little bit more academic. That's usually part of what a 101 class is introducing you to terminology. So what we think of as daydreaming is really the internal perceptual field. Is that basically we think much more quickly than someone can speak. So eventually we begin to wander in our thoughts, and you can lose quite a bit of information when that occurs. And the external perceptual field is basically our environment. And again, I think we know this intuitively, that if it's too cold, if it's too hot, if there's poor lighting, if there's noise, all of that is going to direct attention away from the speaker. Some of these things we can control, some of these things we can't control. And in terms of you recording yourself, thinking about the kind of environment in which you record yourself in, and the quality of the audio is going to be important, because your peers are going to be watching your speeches, as well as I am going to be watching those speeches. Now, some of the things that can interfere with listening: trigger words, which is something that evokes a strong emotional response so that the person begins thinking about their emotions rather than thinking about the content of what you're saying. And the different kinds of listening that we can all engage in. And I would suggest that we're going to do all of this when we're listening to the speeches of others. Appreciative listening, listening for entertainment. But usually when you're listening just for entertainment, let's say you're going to a concert, then you miss a lot. For instance, discriminative listening, the presentation. And obviously we will be talking about the presentation of speeches. And listening with empathy. And again, we are all in the same situation in that we have to deliver a speech in this particular class. So I think all of us can be emotionally supportive of each other as we are on that particular journey. And yes, we usually listen for things like comprehension, which is probably what you're doing now, for information. But critical listening, questioning, analyzing, interpreting, asking why, that's really the kind of listening that we're talking about when we're talking about listening from an academic standpoint. In fact, there are even questions you can ask yourself when you're listening to speeches. And if you'll remember, in the syllabus and course outline, I had attached a speech rating handout that I'm going to be using for the first speech, actually, where it divides a speech up into the content and the presentation, which is pretty much what we're talking about now. And I'll talk about that speech outline in the future a little bit more in depth. But not only is it a useful resource to help you determine how to put together your speeches, but it's also a useful resource to help you think about how to listen to the speeches of others. And after the first speech, I don't even bother using that template. I just take notes of strengths and weaknesses. But for the first speech, that template basically reviews all of the pieces either we have discussed or will be discussing. Notice that I put most of the textbook readings up front so that you could utilize that information when you are actually constructing and ultimately delivering your speech. So, thinking about your audience, and I believe I had mentioned this earlier in a previous video, that in some ways we're all at an advantage because we know who is going to be in our audience. It's our fellow classmates. And that gives us a wealth of information about age, education, and what language, for instance, might be appropriate that wouldn't be appropriate for another audience, let's say an audience of children, where you would have to adapt and simplify. And usually what we end up having is mixed audiences, where there are multiple cultures, multiple groups that are in that audience. And again, you want to aim towards the greatest denominator, but of course be culturally sensitive as well. So, what does culture influence? Just about everything. We could take an entire class just on culture. Behaviors, these are our actions, and this includes our conversational style. So, in the West, for instance, which is where we are, we oftentimes talk about this very direct conversational style. Get to the point, time is money, that kind of thing. That's not necessarily the way that conversations or workplace dialogue occurs in other cultures or in other places. And usually, when we talk about culture, we talk about these large groups based on either ethnicity or geographic region or gender, but they can be as specialized as you would like them to be. So it could be based on a particular hobby, a particular group. For better or worse, our class is a culture. It's a group of individuals who basically have some shared commonalities. But just because we have shared commonalities, that doesn't necessarily mean we are all the same. That doesn't necessarily mean we will all behave the same way. But going back to conversational styles, in Asia, for instance, it oftentimes is much more common to be less direct and to suggest and imply, and also to engage in storytelling. And it's not that one way is better than another, it's just different. And certainly, individuals in the business world, as well as the military, have spent a good amount of time talking about these differences in conversation because ultimately they're going to need to interact with different cultural groups. And you don't want to do something that's considered offensive by another cultural group, or at least that is misunderstood by another cultural group. And yes, your cultural membership will influence your attitudes, your feelings. Those can change, and sometimes they stay the same, sometimes they change. And it can also influence your beliefs, things that you think are true and false. But your values, which are usually firmly embedded, those are something that usually incorporate all of the above beliefs, attitudes, behaviors, and they're oftentimes highly resistant to change. So when we talk about things like the persuasive speech, our last speech of this semester, we'll talk about how the goal isn't necessarily to have everybody in your audience agree with you. That's an impossibility. Some values are so firmly embedded in your audience members that it doesn't matter what you say or do in your speech, you are never going to change their position. But what you can aim to do is to gain their respect. While someone can say they can respect the time and effort and position that you have put forward, they don't necessarily agree with your argument. And I think that's really something that our society is struggling with now, is how do you find a way to civilly disagree with other individuals? Expect, as I said, lots of cultures because we live in a multicultural society, which just means many cultures. And note that I'm oversimplifying all of this. This could be an entire semester's worth of work. The study of cultural groups and the study of individuals is known as demographics, the observable characteristics of individuals. Again, we usually think of large group memberships like age or gender or ethnic background or education or political affiliation or religion. But again, it could be very specialized, such as the membership in a particular class. And the idea of people who do this basically for a living, oftentimes people in advertising, as they are trying to determine which groups, which demographic groups are likely to be interested in their particular message and how to make other demographic groups also interested in their message. This relies on audience segmentation, dividing your demographic groups into continual subgroups so that you can determine how to direct the message. Of course, with the internet, now we have individualized targeting of messaging, something that really is relatively new in our society. And there are pros and cons to that, as we are experiencing as I speak, when we see the influence of things like social media and the influence of things like the internet and artificial intelligence. Now, there is some profiling that goes on when you examine demographic groups. Psychological profiling, trying to anticipate what somebody's belief is, true or false. I can guess that most of you probably believe that textbooks are too expensive. You may not all agree with that, but I suspect the bulk of you will. Your attitudes, your emotional responses, and my belief is that you all have an attitude of the value of education, or else you wouldn't be in this class. Again, it might vary in terms of its intensity. And your values, your underlying attitudes and beliefs, which might be much more broad than the benefits of a college degree, but it could be about the importance of a well-educated citizenry in our country. But again, we want to avoid those stereotypes, those overgeneralizations, because of course there is always individual variance. Now, the textbook talks a little bit about what to do if you ever present to a hostile audience, and you certainly wouldn't be in that position in this particular class. I don't know if you would ever be in that position. Usually the speaker is well aware that they are entering that. It oftentimes happens in the political realm when you're speaking to a group that doesn't necessarily support your particular politics or agenda. So oftentimes speakers know what they're getting into. But what is much more common is that you could be speaking to a skeptical audience, an audience that is not terribly supportive of your particular position. Again, I don't have a magic bullet for you, but I can give some suggestions, which the text also reviews. Establish goodwill, that everyone's trying their best. Establish areas of agreement. Rather than focusing on the places where people differ, focus on the places where people agree or are the same. Establish credibility, that you have a certain knowledge base and expertise. It's one of the reasons why for the third speech, the persuasive speech, I'm going to ask you to cite a minimum of 3 outside sources, because that'll help you establish a certain level of credibility, which makes you more persuasive. And of course, when we talk about outside sources, you want to use credible outside sources, which of course we will talk about more as we get closer to the persuasive speech, that we've never had more information as a society, but much of that information is flawed and downright incorrect, because ultimately we don't have gatekeepers in the internet, which is both good and bad. So the bad is that anybody can post anything. The good is that anybody can post anything. And that certainly it democratizes knowledge, but it also means that anybody can put an opinion and list it as a fact. And we don't necessarily have the ability to differentiate every person's post, because ultimately the internet is just filled with an overwhelming amount of information. So might I suggest that relying on the open internet is not necessarily the best way to proceed, as we will discuss when we get to the persuasive speech. Libraries still have their place, databases still have their place, and your personal fact checking definitely has a place, even with artificial intelligence. To try to be as professional as possible, this is the way you earn your audience's respect. Use humor. Humor can be the great unifier. Humor can be tricky too, because humor can oftentimes be misunderstood. It oftentimes is culturally based, so what might be funny for one group may not necessarily be considered humorous for another group. But humor shows our common humanity. Be multi-sided, and I've noticed this definitely, that a lot of times people, they don't even want to have total agreement. They just want to be acknowledged that their position exists. So sometimes that's in and of itself enough. So rather than what I call ignoring the elephant in the room and just pursuing your position and acting as if no other positions exist, acknowledge that there are other positions that might have some elements of validity, but your position is stronger. Now, this is tricky because you don't want to lose control of your speech. So now all of a sudden you're focused on other positions rather than your own position. But certainly if you're able to do this in a skillful way, you usually get your audience's respect and support. And to establish principles of judgment. So sometimes it's just guidelines of how we're going to interact with one another. The last chapter that I had assigned for today was about generating ideas, which is pretty much where you are at this point. I'm giving you the topic. It's autobiographical, and you need to narrow that topic to something specific. Will you give a life overview? will you focus on a particular element? For those of you who don't feel terribly comfortable with self-disclosure, I suggest you might want to talk about education. It's the one thing we all share, whether you talk about your educational history, or you talk about your educational present, or your goals for your educational future, or perhaps a little bit of all three. And you need to determine the purpose. And of course, you might think, well, the purpose is obvious, is to satisfy the requirements so that I can be successful in the course, so that I can continue my educational goals. True. I have a purpose as well, as I wanted you to actually try out some techniques that the textbook talks about. We can learn how to ride a bike by reading about it, but we're not going to be able to balance ourselves on that bike until we actually get on the bike and fall a few times. So the idea is that we actually just have to do it, which is what we will be doing. And I will never forget a story that was told by one of my colleagues to me at another institution. And this was a public speaking teacher who was having a speech or was listening to a speech from one of the students in the class. It was a very philosophical speech about being true to oneself. And as the student began giving the speech, they began to disrobe. And once the student began, or seemed to begin, to take off their pants, the teacher stopped the speech and asked what was happening. And the student responded by saying that they wanted to show the audience their true selves, because this was about being true to themselves. And the teacher ended it right then and there. Might I suggest that the student really didn't consider the audience and the occasion and the purpose of that speech. That in this particular instance, speaking in an academic setting to classmates and an instructor is not appropriate to disrobe. Now, that's not to say that you can't shock the audience. It's one of the ways that you can engage your audience members, particularly in an introduction or conclusion, which we'll talk a little bit more about next class. But you need to be careful when you start pushing boundaries that way. So if nothing else, might I suggest that student did not consider the purpose, audience, and occasion when they delivered that speech and attempted to disrobe. Gathering material. Sometimes you know what you're going to speak about, so you don't need to gather material, but sometimes you need to find material, which we will be talking about further as we talk about outside resources for the later speeches in the semester. And certainly there's nothing to preclude you from gathering material with your autobiographical speech. So if you felt moved to interview family and friends or to look up Ellis Island records, you certainly could. But the idea behind the first speech is that you already have the knowledge base necessary to deliver that speech. That speech is about you and your experiences, so that you can focus on some of the elements that the textbook is talking about in terms of generating ideas and constructing outlines and creating introductions and bodies and conclusions, and ultimately some of the elements with delivering speeches. Now, making a speaking outline is something that will be discussed in depth next class, and the textbook talks a little bit about it. But if you're curious about my own outlines, you've got them right there below my video. That is a true blue real outline that I actually use. And what I do is I just divide up topics, as you can see, and I bold them, and then I've got subtopics underneath. There are lots of different ways to do outlines, and we'll talk a little bit about that next class. There is no right or wrong way. As long as you find that your outline is useful to you, then that's the right way. But definitely less is more in a speaking outline, because you want to be able to maintain things like eye contact. You don't want to be reading your outline word for word in monotone, as we will discuss. So usually keywords and phrases are very helpful in terms of outlining. And then practicing. And the more you practice, the more comfortable you become with the material, and the less likely you are to feel anxious. Then finally, delivering the speech. And there's even a graphic on page 104 that goes through the process of generating ideas. But this is where I suspect you are now. And then in our next class, what I wanted to talk about specifically was organizing and outlining, introductions, conclusions, and transitions, and also language. Very soon we'll be getting to the point where we would have finished the bulk of the textbook. That's deliberate so that you can utilize that information in the construction of your speeches. And then the pieces of the textbook we haven't addressed, we will over the course of the semester when they become more applicable to your second speech, which is the informative speech, and your third speech, which is the persuasive speech. And all speeches can be unified, all three of them, so that they all talk about generally the same topic, or they can all be distinctly different from one another. So it just depends. But your informative speech is going to ask you to teach us about something. Perhaps you'll teach us about something that you discussed in your autobiographical speech, but not required. And your persuasive speech will be to try to convince us of something, which could be something that you discussed in your informative and autobiographical speech, but again, not necessary. So I just lay that out there so you can let that percolate in the back of your mind. So our attendance question for today, as you know, you have 48 hours for responding to your attendance question. So your response would be due on the discussion forum on Saturday, the 20th. But certainly if you need additional time, you can ask me. What do you think will be your biggest challenge delivering speech number 1 and why? What do you think will be your biggest challenge delivering speech number 1 and why? And as you know, you're not required to respond to your classmates, but you are required to read their responses. And I will indeed be responding in turn, so that if you were to read all of that, you basically would get a sense of what we would do in a class discussion forum. So at this point, I think I will leave you with considering speech number 1 and what might be your biggest challenge. I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And we will continue on next class to talk about organizing and outlining, introductions, conclusions, and transitions, and language. Take care. Bye-bye.